As we continue on with books 7 and 8 of the Odyssey, remember Odysseus is still in the kingdom of the Phaeacians with King Alcinous and Queen Arete. He has just met with the king and queen's daughter Nausicaa, who is the princess, and Odysseus has been instructed to go and speak directly with the queen. And this is somewhat contrary to what we have encountered in the past with the other books because there has not been such an importance placed upon any of the female characters. In the past, females have been more of a war prize or a possession, and here it's more of an elevated position that since Odysseus has been instructed to go and to speak with her. And then, in light of that, both the king and the queen are in keeping with the code of hospitality. And this is basically a code that was given by Zeus to all of the people who were living in any land. And it is an overall theme that runs throughout the poems. The host is to willingly give openly to his guests. You come in, or the guest would come in, they are to be fed, given shelter for the night, cleaned, bathed, given necessary clothes or supplies. And this was just something that has been understood. And if you were to keep in the good graces of the gods, you were to adhere to that. We have seen this so far with Telemachus and Mentes, whereas Telemachus welcomes in, and he didn't know at the time that it was Athena, but he welcomes this guest into his home. And then also with Nestor, as he openly welcomed Telemachus into his home and fed and bathed him and gave him the necessary supplies. And then the same thing with Menelaus to Telemachus, that once he reached Sparta, Menelaus and Helen opened up, even though they were in the midst of a wedding, or two weddings actually, they stopped and made time to see this traveling guest. And this is very much so a complete difference of character or opinion or belief system from the way that most people live in the 21st century today. Speaking for people as a whole, people are much more private, much more less welcoming to strangers, because there is a greater element of fear. Even when you start driving, you are discouraged from picking up a hitchhiker because you don't know who that person is or where they had come from. But if you were living back in ancient Greek times, you would have been expected to welcome this person in. And so finally, we get to the Phaeacians, and we see Alcinous, who has as a very good example of a person adhering to this code of hospitality. Because of this code of hospitality, you were not certain if you may be entertaining a divine character, a god or goddess, at the time, in disguise. The Phaeacians thought that Odysseus may be a god. Alcinous believed he may have been testing their faithfulness. The Phaeacians themselves were somewhat divine. And then also, we typically see Athena appearing to Odysseus in pure form. However, she has disguised herself sometimes to avoid persecution by Poseidon. We will see later in later books why Poseidon has this vendetta against Odysseus and therefore against Athena, because she is basically the patron saint of Odysseus. But it also gives us somewhat of an insight into the importance of that Athena gives to Odysseus, because she appears to him in a pure form and not necessarily in a disguised one. But overall, the fear and the respect for a divine being in disguise would prompt people to adhere to this code of hospitality as well. In Book 8, we encounter many, many new characters, but some are of more importance, such as Demodocus, who is a blind bard who entertains Odysseus and the Phaeacians, and then Laodamas, who is the son of Alcinous, the greatest Scarian athlete, and Phaeacia was in the country of Scaria, or Sharia, however you choose to say that. And then also Euryalus, who is a Phaeacian athlete who insults Odysseus. So he does not adhere to this code of hospitality that we see. In book 8, we see Demodocus, and he sings the songs of Odysseus's past. And this allows us as the reader, again, to get more of that backstory. Remember, we start in medias res, in the middle of things, so there's got to be some kind of device that allows us to go back in time. When Odysseus hears this, he begins to weep openly about this. And Demodocus is somewhat a mirror of Homer. If you think back from just different things that you've read, different things that you've studied, Homer is the first one that is noted to write down all of these stories. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, all of these types of stories were told through an oral narrative, which is you would have a bunch of people who would sit around in a tavern or a great hall, and they would have one of these bards that they would pay. It usually was somebody that was just kind of a vagrant, just traveling through. Again, you didn't know if it was a god or not, so you would open up your home to them, but you would feed and give them, give them drink and shelter for the night, and then they in turn, their payment, so to speak, would be giving these stories. And so everybody was very familiar with these stories. And then Odysseus begins to weep. Upon doing that, Alcinous becomes greatly concerned that his guest is so unhappy in his house. And to lighten the mood somewhat, Demodocus sings of the story of Aphrodite and Ares' affair. And that is not so much that it furthers the plot, but it kind of just gives a comic relief, because this story is very, it discusses Ares and Aphrodite being caught in their affair by Aphrodite's husband, Hephaestus, and how he tricks them. So it kind of, alleviates some of the tension, and it also just gives more texture to the story. The people listening or the people reading at that time would have been very, very familiar with these stories. And then he also gives more of the story of the Trojan horse and of Troy. And that is something that we do not get in the Iliad. We do not get what happens after Hector dies and how Troy falls. And then we move on in book 8 and we get a section of contest and games. Alcinous' son Laodamas asks Odysseus to come play. Euryalus insults Odysseus because he declines, saying that he is an old man basically and not willing to or strong enough to get up and fight or get up and play. And then Alcinous asks Odysseus after that to reveal his identity. And so that's kind of the cliffhanger that we get at the end of book 8. Now, keeping with this theme of the mortals and the immortals, we have a comparison of how they act in the Iliad versus how they act in the Odyssey. The gods are concerned mostly for themselves. They quarrel over very petty affairs. If they are wounded, they flee to recover. And this is all of the mortals, and then or the immortals. And then the mortals have to overall pay a higher price. And we get that in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So both of these examples are something that can be compared or contrasted in both of the epic poems. And it was something that was very familiar to the listeners or to the readers of that day because it was a part of their culture at the time.